Welcome, Vivan, to
Thank you.
Bangalore.
Thanks for having me.
And so this book, I received this about a week ago. Until then, I must confess, I didn't know who millennials were. I thought it was people who were born in year 2000 onwards. And then I realized it isn't that. So this book opened up. That was the first thing that I had to learn from the book was millennials are termed as people born between 1981 and 1996. So those who attained young adulthood at the turn of the millennium. So Lekha asked how many of our people here in the audience are millennials. And some of you put up your hand. Please be ready at the end. We might have some time actually to ask you what you thought of this conversation and whether that made sense to you and your own lived experiences. So if there's anything you would like to add towards the end. But I also want to ask how many of us here are trying to understand or figure out what millennials are all about? Okay, so sort of the rest, and as well I see millennials as well, trying to figure out who they are. The shades of many colors. So, Vivan, my first question actually to you, I read that you started writing this book, putting this book together in 2018 when you were 22, 23?
Yeah, 22, 23.
Yeah. And so why this urge to put something like this together? What made you think of this as a subject, as your first book?
Yeah, so when I started this book, I actually didn't even know it was going to be a book. I just started it as a research project to ask some questions because I was working at a think tank in Delhi. And it was a really interesting job. I got to, rub shoulders with a variety of people in politics, in the business world, in the tech community. And I began to realize that, in our confidence in Delhi and in our confidence in Mumbai, we were kind of missing the rest of India. And we didn't fully understand the country and the people we were trying to serve. And so at a policy level, people were designing policies for, but at a business level, people were selling products to, or consumers were trying to acquire. And the way I came upon this realization was my grandparents live in Bhopal. And we call Bhopal, a small town, but it's a city of 1 million people and it's rapidly urbanizing. And I go to Bhopal almost every 6 to 8 weeks. And there's, someone who, lives in their house, and he's my age. And I remember that, he was getting his MBA while I was finishing up with my undergrad. And then a few weeks later, he was watering my grandmother's lawn. And I asked her, why is he, he just finished his MBA, like, why is he doing this? And she just, very matter of fact told me, yeah, like he's doing this now. He tends to the gardens in the neighborhood. And I began to, that was like a kind of a big wake up call for me because, this is someone who was almost my age. We'd grown up together. And he just finished his MBA, but there were no jobs for him in Bhopal for him to actually use that degree. And now this is, the quality of that degree notwithstanding, the fact that, even in the city where there is a lot of, construction projects, taking place, the fact that, you have so many young people who are just completely unemployed was a big, wake up call to me. And when I went back and I started talking about it, I really began to realize that, we need to be doing much more work in this space. If you let me go on for just 30 seconds, but later in 2019, the election year, in January, the Business Standard newspaper, broke that report of the NSSO job survey that, India was experiencing 45-year high unemployment. And a lot of people were very surprised by that, but I had already done a year of field work. And I would just go to all of these small towns. I was in Mysore, I was in other towns in, Karnataka and South India and, of course, North India. And you just go to these places and unemployment is just so widespread. And the concept of a formal job is actually not that ingrained or common, that I felt that someone needs to write about this, and what it means for our millennials who are our future. And just India itself has 440 million millennials.
And that's 34% of our population you mentioned, right?
Exactly. And it's the world's largest population of millennials, and it's more than the entire population of the US and Canada combined. So I really wanted to understand, what life is like for the Indian millennial outside of Delhi and Bombay. And, what are people's attitudes towards jobs and marriage and sex and religion and politics. So that's kind of where the book comes from.
Okay. So, while reading the book, there were a couple of things that I was very surprised and impressed by, Vivan. One is the depth of research that Vivan has done for the book. So one, of course, your primary research, your qualitative, the interviews you've taken, and he's gone to small towns, tier 2, tier 3 towns and cities across India. And therefore, the book comes up as a very rich kind of lived experiences of people that often we may just see in cinema and not even interact if we haven't lived in small towns ourselves. But the second thing is the secondary data that he uses, and a lot of the statistics which you sort of go back and forth with, the CSDS statistics. And it's almost like you take the statistic, then you verify it through your own experiences, what's happened, how people are talking to you, and then you go back to this to check. So that process I found really exciting about putting a book like this together. So before we go deep dive, one little question about methodology. What were some of the challenges in writing a book like this, where some data exists, but you're not sure whether that data is everything you want, and you have to go out there and speak to people? But like you're saying, it's 400 million. That's a huge number. How do you even have the confidence to say what I'm picking up is really a picture? So methodology, research, study-wise, what were some of your difficulties?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something I grappled with a lot naturally while writing the book. Is like, where do you start? Who are you writing about? And is even the interviews that you've done, are they even representative? Because I did 900 interviews, and people in the research world know that that's quite a bit. But 900, in a population of 440 million is nothing. So at some point, you have to decide, like, when is enough, and when enough is enough as well. And so for folks who haven't read the book, as Arundhati mentioned, I rely on two principal sources of information. So one is the data set that the CSDS Lokniti project, the youth survey that they put together, which they do every 10 years. And in that youth survey, they have 6,500 respondents. So that's pretty representative. And then my own interviews. And what I did was, so I first went through the survey, I had their raw data, and I looked at the big trends that surprised me. And in many ways, the book buying audience in India, English book buying audience, are also people like me, and who largely live in urban areas, and they want to know more about what's going on, but the media doesn't necessarily provide that kind of information. And so one of the things that really surprised me was how so many young people still list a government job as their top priority. And, again, if you go to small town India, the writing's on the wall in terms of, the number of government job, coaching institutes and things like that. But if you live in Delhi or in Bangalore or in Mumbai, and you look at places like Whitefield and Gurgaon and Bandra Kurla complex, it's pretty hard to fathom that, so many people still want government jobs. So to answer your question, I looked at the big findings in the survey that were kind of surprising, and then I sort of tried to validate them in the interviews I was doing. And I profiled a few people who've actually, I don't know if you're going to ask me about them, but a few people who are, kind of have devoted many years of their lives to getting government jobs. And then I also, some individuals I profile in the book actually go against the data. But I say that, these are millennial stories that would not have been able to, take place 20 years ago. So I include them because these are stories that they might not be representative, but they're very interesting and could have only taken place today.
And you break up the book into 5 key chapters. One is education, one is economic aspiration, one is marriage and social views, one is technology and social media, and finally political ideas and attitudes. And so I was wondering why these, did you decide that before? Or did you, when you were sitting with all the material, figured that this is where how the pattern is emerging?
Yeah, so I initially had 4. I broke the social into tech and social media and marriage.
And marriage and social views.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, if you look at the millennial existence today, these are sort of the 4 or 5 big things that contribute to daily life, is that what is the education you got, and what is the education that millennials got? What job do you have, or what type of job do you want? How do you interact with others in real life and on the internet? And then finally the big marriage question, right? And whether it's an arranged marriage, love marriage, and kind of why it is one of those two. And then politics, because in India, politics definitely more than other countries determines so much of daily life over here.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is, this is what we had planned, that we'll deep dive into each of these chapters, and I'll try and see how Vivaan can explain some of the things that really intrigued me or that I had questions about while I was reading it. And maybe towards the end, we can go back to a few more questions which are slightly more general about the book. So the first chapter is education, and it really breaks your heart to read that chapter. Because what you realize, as Vivaan so eloquently and very, I must say, very insightfully has drawn out, is the total failure of the public education system in being unable to reach the millions that it should have. And on the other hand, the private education system being more of a profit-making, quick buck kind of industry. And in that span, I was wondering, where do you get quality education at a decent price? Also, good education is available, but for which you have to pay such a huge amount that it becomes a sort of entry barrier. A luxury good and an entry barrier for anybody to kind of be able to afford it. So I was wondering, we keep saying this now, simple living, high thinking. Is that out? Is that idea that one could actually get quality education in a budget price totally out? Or do you see, after you've talked to so many education institutes, you've talked to professors, you've talked to administrators, you've done the legwork hugely, and talked to aspirants of the system. Is private-public partnership a model for the future? How do we crack this? Because you've critiqued both sides, the public sector and the private sector. So where do we go from here?
So, one of the things I do in the book is I really don't make a lot of predictions or offer solutions because I'm 26 and I feel like there's, if you want, solutions, there's people who've been doing this work for decades. But what, in the conversations I had with those who have been doing this work is that, there's one theme that emerges, and I feel many in the audience might relate with, is that in India, we have a filtering system that we call an education system. And basically what we're doing is we're filtering students and young Indians towards IIT or IIM or medical school or a government job. And what we're not actually doing is educating people to, really do any of these jobs. And, if you look at Kota in Rajasthan, now Netflix also has a show, Kota Factory, and there's many places like Kota, so in the book I talk about Indore, is that you have, entire industries that have taken over these towns, which is the education industry. And you have, coaching centers and finishing schools and, all types of, private operators who are offering, some type of, silver bullet to, families who really want their kids to enter the middle class or, go beyond. And I think the problem over here is that we're just approaching this the wrong way, that we are just filtering people towards better opportunities or towards existing opportunities as opposed to really building a foundation of strong education. So Germany, for example, has a very strong apprenticeship program. And so by the time kids reach class 10 in Germany, a lot of them don't even do, 2 more years of school. They'll go to like carpentry school, or they'll become nurses, or, they go straight to medical school to become doctors. And I think that's something really interesting that we could try over here. I also think that, many people might disagree that we've also over prioritized college for a lot of people. And better than, going
but
to...
that, like you very, very aptly later talk about, it has a class and caste question as well.
Exactly,
because your
yeah.
work is connected to caste as well.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
But, nowadays, like something in Silicon Valley, and I know in Bangalore as well, there's some startups that are doing this, is that you can become a software programmer online. And, there's, it's called Lambda School in the US. In India, there's, I think it's called Masai School, where you can be a housewife and you take, coding classes. And in 2-3 years, these people are getting amazing jobs. And so, you don't even need an undergrad level, education for that. So I think, these types of innovative ideas are the ones that are going to work. And also just sort of deprioritizing the education system we have right now, because, nature abhors a vacuum. So the few IITs that were built, in the 50s that I write about are the same good ones today. Yeah. And then you had these private folks, who come in to fill in the gaps, particularly in South India and Andhra Pradesh. And they're sort of connected to a local politician. And then there's the whole land mafia. So it's, it's become this big business. And what gets lost in the business is actual education.
Is the education, yeah. But what you're talking about would require so many, and that's why all these things are connected, right? That to even find that kind of dignity of labor, you'll have to deeply eradicate the caste question, because because what you're saying, this overemphasis of college education is also a very Brahminical understanding of what education might be. It's the use of the mind as the higher thing than the use of hands or or the use of the body as such, right? So, I really liked, you quoted here from Amartya Sen and John Drez's book, Islands of California in a Sea of Sub-Saharan Africa. As this is described as the Indian case, the particular Indian case. And so I'll move to your next chapter, which is economic aspirations. And this is as dreary a chapter as the first one. This is, again, a whole list of failures of the state, of being unable to provide jobs, of the private sector not being able to reach out to the millions as they should have and create new jobs. Questions about job security still lying very much with the government sector, and that's why a lot of young people in smaller towns and villages wanting those kind of jobs and working for years to get one such job. And I know this because I come from a small town called Asansol, and all the young men and women that I knew in Asansol wanted a railway job, actually. And railway still stands like number one, railway, SBI. These are the jobs that people wanted because it's for life and you get a pension at the end, you're set. I was also looking at the questions you raise about the gig economy, right? So the Uber and the Swiggies of the world and their nature of exploitation that happens there. So here in this chapter, I was really wanting to understand, do you think, from your survey of talking to people, that even entrepreneurship or the startup that a lot of young people today talk about, even in small towns, is only possible with a certain kind of background in financial capital or social capital in the form of networks? Or is it possible to break the barrier with more innovative ways? You give some examples, and they're very exciting. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so to answer your question, I think to break your question apart, the first half about existing levels of privilege, you're seeing that slowly erode now. Particularly in Bangalore, there's a lot of first-time entrepreneurs who've come from very different backgrounds, who've traditionally not had access to capital. Byju's, I know, is very polarizing, but Baiju himself, comes from a very humble background, and now, he's worth more than Anand Mahindra, and many people who've, had these family businesses, for generations. And you're seeing more stories like that. Even the founder of Oyo is from a very small town in Odisha. And yes, there's still some sort of caste hegemony that's playing out, but you're also seeing that in India that capital is flowing more to small towns and cities in the last 5 or 10 years that did not happen in liberalization. And so, but there is a big question about the gig economy, and I'm sort of 50-50 on this because, and what I write in the book is that many people who drive for Zomato, they don't have any other alternatives, so it's still money that they're making that they would not have made, being in their village. But at the end of the day, it's extremely exploitative work. So, for example, when Zomato announced, paid parental leave and these amazing things, it was for everyone in their offices, their white collar staff.
Not really the delivery
Yeah,
men and
exactly,
women.
exactly. And those people, for a long time, they were paying for their own insurance. That they lacked, basic, security that gig workers elsewhere in the world have, including in the US, where conditions are not that good for
And
gig
I'm guessing
workers.
it's also exploitative because it's also like if you're late, then you are penalized, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And the Zomato ad, like the Katrina Kaif ad where he goes to deliver her food and he's like, oh my God, this is Katrina Kaif and I want to get a picture with her. And by the time that, she comes back out, he leaves, the Zomato driver leaves because he has to make another delivery. And Zomato pulled that ad because, people were like, this is really tone deaf and this does not reflect well on you. And at the end of the day, the unit economics for these drivers are not good at all. So I write about Uber. I had a series of conversations with the high-level executive at Uber. And what I say is that the conclusion I arrive at is that in the gig economy, the game is always rigged against the workers. And so what Uber does is they have an algorithm where they determine, supply and demand. And they determine a price a salary that every driver should roughly make in Indian cities. So in Delhi, it can be 20,000 a month. In Calcutta, it's 14,000. In Bangalore, it's a little bit higher. What that means is that no matter how the actual economy is doing, because Uber regulates supply and demand, the driver is only going to make the same amount of money. And so, if there's a lot of demand but not enough supply, the driver's not going to make more money. And it's really not, and in India, the gig economy is not, if I wanted to drive for Uber tomorrow, I can't. Because I need a commercial driver's license and things like that. Whereas in other parts of the world, the gig economy gives you flexibility to really, study for law school and drive for Uber, or to, have two jobs and, make some supplemental income. But over here, that's not the case because so many people use it as a full-time job. So you really need to, we need to figure out a way where there's some more security because otherwise it's these men who have families and are risking a lot in these jobs with very little, actual money that they're making.
And you think that it is, and because my next question is connected to it, there are two lovely stories that you talk about the internet, and it's connected to jobs and economic aspiration. Nazneen's story of starting a beauty parlor at home, and then, coming out of an abusive marriage, starting out on her own, knowing nobody actually from her parents' home, from the living room, and then going out and starting a salon outside. And you talk about Sumit, the Dalit rap icon who uses the internet. So I'm going to connect your earlier chapter of economic aspiration to the next one about technology and social media. While at one end, there is this huge benefit that the internet, social media, technology has given to break the traditional entry barriers to a lot of things. And therefore, one could say, making the economy more democratic in a certain way. But on the other hand, what it has also done, as you mentioned, is it has flattened debates, it's taken out nuances from our understanding of the world and how we interact with each other. So if you were to sum up the impact of technology and social media, as you have seen on millennials, what would you say?
I'd say net, it's been very positive. And precisely why, to share with the audience, the two people, Arundhati just mentioned. One of them, her name is Nazni, and she's a woman I met who, was a domestic abuse survivor, and she left an abusive marriage and came home to Hyderabad to her parents, a couple of months pregnant. And she just started, during her pregnancy, she just started watching these videos on YouTube all day long. And they were these makeup tutorials. And then she has her kid and she realizes, well, I need to do something. And what do I know? I know how to apply makeup. And so she just started applying makeup on, girls in her neighborhood. Then it eventually became bridal makeup. Then it eventually led to her hiring someone. Then that led to her opening her own salon and hiring many other people. And how did she get her clients? She got her clients on Facebook and WhatsApp. They became her word of mouth. And her teacher, of course, was YouTube. And, this is a very uniquely millennial story. And it's a positive story that I don't know if someone in her position would have ever been able to, have 20 years ago. And it was made possible today because of the internet, because of social media. I also write about someone named Sumit Samos, who's a Dalit rapper from Odisha. And in 2016, he started uploading these rap videos. And after Rohit Vemula's suicide in Hyderabad, one of his videos went viral. And he, was invited to rap at concerts in India and then in Paris, in Mauritius. And just this year, actually, he got into Oxford on a master's program, but they didn't give him a scholarship. So he went to social media, he went to Twitter and Facebook, and he crowdfunded 45 lakhs to go to Oxford, and he's there right now. And, imagine that, imagine that story even 10 years ago, that, a Dalit boy from Odisha, doing any of these things and making it to Oxford on a crowd-funded scholarship. Yeah. And so I know that, a lot of discourse has been coarsened on social media. But at the end of the day, it's just also the internet has just made so many opportunities available that a young woman in Bhopal has the same access to information and opportunities as a young man in Bangalore or in Delhi or in Dehradun or in any of these places. And that's the real beauty of the internet. Of course, social media, there's the whole regulation debate, but the net positives definitely outweigh the negatives.
Yeah, and talking about young Dalit men, Jignesh Mevani, he raised his entire capital for running his campaign from Gujarat on Our Democracy .in. So there are these possibilities that one couldn't imagine this before, right? We always said good people can't join politics because you don't have the cash that you need to actually run campaigns, right?
Exactly.
So this part was fascinating, which I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about some of the statistics you give, right, in the next series about your next chapter on social values. 80% of millennials believe religion is important. 50% believe in religion over science. 14% believe in science over religion. 60% feel that you should ban films and books if they hurt religious sentiments. And 6% believe in love marriage. Honestly, I may have picked up the wrong ones, but I shuddered. I shuddered for many reasons, but mostly I shuddered thinking that I have, as somebody who's going to be 50 next year, I've learned a lot from my young colleagues at work. And I shuddered to think that what some of these things indicate is a preference of tradition and learned knowledge, learned behavior over deciding for yourself what you want. A certain throwing away of opportunity to judge for yourself. That's what was hitting me more than saying religion, faith is more important than science. What it really meant was, what does then that religion, faith mean? So I felt worried. Are you?
I don't take a I'm not trying to be diplomatic, but I'm not taking a position on this because, in a lot of ways, my role in writing this book is to share the stories of of Indian millennials, and not to sort of put my own opinion in here. Something interesting, though, in the figures you cited is the more educated millennials are, the more they favor religion over science. And that's the survey that found that. It's on the same page, you know. So in fact, that, you know, the CSDS study found that those who were less educated tended to favor science more over religion, and as you get more educated, you favor religion more over science.
That
So
wouldn't have been intuitive for me, actually. That's
I-
like we believe.
for a lot of people.
Then you can just discard the chapter on education right after that.
But you know, about religion and spirituality, in a lot of ways, it's about identity, and it's also why the education thing makes sense, because in today's day and age, and you know, the plus sides of, you know, the internet is that you have all of this access, but the downside is that everyone kind of is the same. And what that means is that you're looking for this identity that you might not get in your job. So like, my identity is not the job I have. My identity are the interests I have, or the, you know, communities I'm a part of. And in a large part of India, the communities that people are members of are their religious communities or their spiritual communities. So someone I met earlier this year, who's not in the book was done by then, is a young lady who who was a follower of a cult, a sect in northern India, in Haryana. And the cult founder had been arrested in 2017-18 on, you know, there were rape allegations against him. I don't know if people are familiar with who I'm talking about. And she was still a hardcore follower of his. She still believed in him. And I asked her why, you know, why is this? And she told me, you know, number one, in her village in Haryana, she's not really allowed to leave the home after the sun sets. But when she's allowed to go to the ashram, you know, main ashram ja rahi hu, nobody questions that, you know. And then when she gets to the ashram, she has this purpose, and she has this physical environment where she can have other conversations with other young women and men her age that she cannot have in her village. So, you know, she really has this liberation that she lacks in her real life and her non-spiritual life. And then finally, you know, it gives her this identity that I'm Babaji's follower, you know, and that identity you don't get. I said this on Twitter recently. I got some pushback, but you don't get that identity from saying I'm an atheist. You know, not a lot of people say I'm a proud atheist, but far more people will say I'm a proud Hindu, I'm a proud Christian, I'm a proud Muslim, I'm a proud Buddhist, because it gives you this identity that otherwise people are not, you know, they lack in their everyday lives.
So you make this very interesting point, you know, and these two characters that you talk about, Basant and Riddhi. So Basant is this young man who's progressive and liberal in some parts of his life.
Up to a point.
Up to a point. Yeah. And therefore has chosen the person who he has got married to. The caste did not matter. They both work. They travel together, as you explain. On the other hand, he has very conservative and rigid ideas about politics and what India should be, and that it should be a kind of a Hindu Rashtra. And there, his ideas seemed very limited in terms of allowing for multiple voices to be around. Similarly with Riddhi as well, that she comes from a very conservative place where she has to come home from work and immediately go into the kitchen and help her mother-in-law and the other bahus of the house to look after the men. And yet the question she asks is exactly the kind of questions that any feminist would ask, I would say. I mean, so we see these different colors on the same people. And you say very nicely at that part that if there is anything that is a truism in India, it is these contradictions in the same person. But how do you think, so from talking to so many people, how do you think people live with these contradictions? Don't they see them conflict in their lives, or do they negotiate? Have they kept it in different compartments? How is it possible for them to live?
I mean, I think this is not endemic to India. This you have all over the world, where, you know, this paradox exists, you know, for a lot of millennials. And in the US also, you're seeing this play out where, you know, folks who, you know, you're seeing this on the left and the right, that the left is not as liberal as they claim to be, and the right is not as, traditionally conservative as they've said, for decades they were. Family values mattered until a thrice divorced, person got their nomination. So I think, the paradox is not something unique to India, but it is something fascinating. That Riddhi is like this Congress supporter I met, and I was so surprised because everywhere was doing my field work in northern India, I didn't meet any Congress supporters who were millennials, and she's the first one I met, and then she sort of also had like this
Are you
other.
going to tell us who they supported instead?
Sorry, I mean.
Are you going to tell us? No, you don't have to. But
We're getting there. And then, she had an arranged marriage because her sister had a love marriage, which did not really work out because unke baitne ka tarika alag tha and all of that. But she was, she's raised by professionals, and she was telling me, and, like almost like basically crying that we both work. She and her husband both work, and they leave the home at basically the same time, but she has to wake up an hour and a half before him to make breakfast.
To do the housework, essentially. Yeah.
And then at 7, they both get back, and he lies down and watches Netflix, and she's like making dinner. And she says, I don't even mind doing it, but I don't want to be taken for granted. And I want some acknowledgement for the work I'm doing. And I've seen, shades of, this wherever I was doing my interviews, all over India. The other paradox, which I think, we might get to at a later stage, but, even in Kerala, it's a state that's very progressive at the surface level. But, in the Christian church in Kerala, people often don't know that it has a very deeply entrenched caste system. And in my book, I write about the murder of a young Dalit Christian man named Kevin, who fell in love with a Syrian Christian girl. And in the hierarchy, the Syrian Christians, are at the top and the Dalit Christians are not. And he was murdered by the girl's family. And the interesting thing is that the girl's parents, the dad was Christian, but the mom was Muslim. So it's not even like the mom was a Syrian Christian, but the mom was upper class. So, you really have this, a triangle of caste, class, and, status that played out in this story. And I met so many, millennials, even in Kerala, who are, have very different views from, other parts of India on certain things. But then the arranged marriage and all of that is also very common over there.
Also, I mean, with lots of my women friends in Kerala who've grown up in Kerala, swear by how misogynistic the society is and how it's so difficult for a woman to actually go out and get a drink. And anybody who's traveled to Kerala would know, I know, it's really hard. And it has the highest level of literacy.
Yes.
It has the highest level of women's literacy. And in so many other ways, and also progressive politics, etc., etc. So it's very difficult to put these things together, right? That's another kind of paradox that one lives with.
But to be totally fair, it's difficult for anyone to get a drink in Kerala. So,
okay.
I mean, not just women.
Yes, accepted.
I've done a lot of fieldwork there.
I would just say men find it slightly easier than women.
But it's hard.
It's hard. Yes, it is hard. So one question, this was really a question about, while I was reading through the marriage and the social views point, and you have so beautifully through the book, Vivan, talked about class, caste, how these things overlap, and specifically in the Indian context, the urban-rural also makes a difference in the class, caste question. Religion, gender, you've brought in, without sort of emphasizing or making a song and dance about it, you have place them in your arguments. What I missed actually is any conversation around the queer community. And this is specifically I ask because, again, I have learned so much about other ways of being, sexual orientation, the queer world from my younger friends. And I think my generation growing up, we were all in the closet. None of us actually would even have the language or the words of rights or acknowledgement or identity. And many people from the younger communities have shown us, how to be. So I was wondering, did you meet people who were queer who didn't want to talk or wanted to talk? How did you deal with that question?
So, to be totally honest with you, when you're doing fieldwork in India, particularly as a man traveling alone, it's often difficult to, even ask basic questions because you have to establish a level of comfort with the person you're talking to. And I know a lot of women user researchers as well who find it hard to talk to other women, even when they travel together, because you have to have that level of comfort. Like in a lot of small towns I went to, I was honestly very scared to talk to anybody over there because one thing you say wrong and you don't know what could happen.
You'll have a situation.
Exactly. And that did happen to me in Indore. I was thrown out of a coaching center, but that was still like more conventional. It's a coaching center. But so to be totally honest with you, it's not a question I really asked a lot of people because it's in India, it's so taboo. And it's so, if someone was willing to share that with me, I would obviously, ask more questions. But it's something only people in urban areas with a certain level of comfort or security talk about openly.
Right.
And what I mean by comfort and security is that, either supportive parents or a stable job that allows you
or
to live on your own,
and social
or peer
support
groups that support you.
Yeah.
And so it's not something that, people talk about openly in India, and it's definitely still, definitely in the closet.
It's kind of, we were talking the other day and saying probably accepting one's queerness and maybe the phobia that one has against trans people are probably the last barrier in India against all kinds of taboos that one sees. So yeah, I understand that this must have been really difficult. So okay, let's move on to the next chapter. Very exciting, political attitudes. And so there's a lot that Vivan puts in terms of his understanding of why politics looks the way it does today, the role that millennials play and will play in the politics of the future. Some of it gives hope, some of it doesn't, but it is what it is, right? I was very struck with something that you say, that millennials want, like, prefer, quote unquote, bold action. I was reminded of thriller films, actually, that you want something solid, you want something specific, you want something determined. And therefore, as he mentions, from demonetization to surgical strikes, all of them are seen as this bold action. And part of why the current regime and its proponents are popular is because they are seen as people who can take these bold actions. And there's also a sense of pride in being citizens of a country that takes bold actions, right? So I was wondering, did you find a sort of negative associated with gentle, kind, supportive? And I'm using these words as to provoke you, obviously. And you know the way Rahul Gandhi is called Pappu, and that's exactly that, right? That's the almost like saying the feminine male. On the other hand, you have the inches of chest and the whole shore around, the josh around a certain kind of masculinity, which is the nation's language, sort of, right? So what do you think is so attractive about it to millennials who themselves are maybe more in touch with their feelings and sensitiveness and humanness than many in our generation? Or am I wrong to suppose that?
So, I love talking about millennials in politics because it's, I've asked a lot of questions, I've written a lot about it, and we can have 10 different conversations. To start with, I'll just provide a data point to everyone in the audience, but millennials in India are the biggest supporters of the BJP and the Prime Minister, and they vote for the BJP on an average of 3 points higher than the national average. And in 2014, many millennials were first-time voters, and they broke very heavily for the BJP. Now, in 2014, that was because, he was the new kid on the block, and he was promising 100 million new jobs and bullet trains and Achhe Din, everything, right? Like, who would not want that? In 2019, none of that was delivered, but people liked him even more. And why did they like him even more? So number one is the bold action that you mentioned, that, I spoke to someone in she was in Mysore, who works at Infosys, and she was telling me how badly demonetization had affected her family because her father-in-law needed to be admitted to hospital. And this is an Infosys employee, very highly educated woman. Her father-in-law had been admitted to hospital, and she didn't have money. But she still loved demonetization, and she loved the prime minister for doing it, because at least he's doing something. At least he's taking on the corrupt elites. At least someone is finally doing something, were the words she had, told me. Similar, about the surgical strikes, that, this guy, he's keeping us safe. And, he's going to really strike Pakistan. And I think there's a term, ghar mein ghus ke maar diya, went into the house and hit them. And people love that. And then there's, of course, the nexus with social media and how this plays out on the internet, which I think I'd love to cover as well. But what I'm really getting to is that this is a uniquely millennial thing that is also not necessarily unique to India. Because if you look at Bernie Sanders, he's also, he promises these big, bold, it's systemic change and, tear down the old system. And that's kind of what Modi is doing over here, right? He's tearing down the old elites. He's replacing the Lutyens elite with his own saffron elite. And what I write is that millennials want leaders who who speak, pray, and look like them. And what that means is that Modi speaks the language of aspiration, and he's talking about, making India shine abroad. So even if your own life you're not doing well, at least your country is doing well, and you have a patriotic duty to re-elect the person who's providing that. Again, I'm just, I'm providing you the responses I heard. Number two is actually language, because in large parts of Hindi-speaking India, they were governed by people who did not necessarily connect with the people who were voting them in. And then you have Modi, who comes, onto the scene, and he speaks in Hindi, not just in India, but even in New York and in London and in Sydney. And these foreign leaders have to listen to him. And the thinking is that if he could do it, so can I. Because most of India does not speak English. Most of India speaks Hindi and then regional languages, Kannada and Telugu and Malayalam and all of that. And so the thinking is that, if you're a small town millennial from a Hindi speaking state, and if Modi could do it, if he could rise up from absolute poverty and become the prime minister, so can I. And so going to your question about gentleness, Rahul Gandhi does not have that life story that people outside of Lutyens Delhi can relate to, because he has not struggled for anything, and he has not risen up from anywhere to this was all given to him. And so, but the other non-Modi and non-BJP leaders who are doing exceedingly well all have similar stories. If you look at Mamta Banerjee in Bengal, she defied all odds to win her re-election, and her story is the exact same as his. She is a proud Bengali woman who stands up for the Bengali identity, who came up from the streets and fought her way up there. And people love that, right?
And is secular.
And is secular. But what I'm getting to is that so if you take Modi out of it, and if you take Mamta out of it, but look at the traits. The traits are about, pride and the life story that we can relate to. And most importantly, about stability and security, because Indians by and large do not want to get a beer with their president or their prime minister, but they want their prime minister to take care of them and to keep them safe. And the whole Mamta Banerjee's Didi, elder sister keeps you safe. Modi, in a lot of Hindi-speaking states where I went, in Madhya Pradesh, people would say, "Wo to hamare guardian hai." He's our guardian. In UP, a journalist I know.
The Chaukidar thing came from there, right? Somebody is going to protect you.
Exactly. And in UP, a journalist I know heard millennials calling Modi Pita, father. And because, he's the one who provides us with, security. And that's why they changed their Twitter handles to Chaukidar ABC, Chaukidar DEF, because people want to feel protected, and they also want to favor their leaders. And so it's this really interesting mix that millennials...
Bhai and Bhakti working together, huh?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. I had one question because you mentioned the other countries and that it's not specific to millennials in India. But I just two different things, one in the UK and one in the US. When one looks at millennials really, and also the generation Z, which is the one after the millennials, there has actually been a surge of people believing less and less in neoliberal economics. There being therefore more Democrats among that age group in the US and more people joining the Labour Party. Especially when Corbyn gave that huge call, there were a number of young people joining in the UK. And it seemed to me that from an understanding of this broad thing, that younger people were actually trying to look back to say, was there anything good about socialism that we can bring back in terms of the same reasons? Lack of security for jobs, not knowing how future looks, insecurity about things like state welfare, which is taken for granted in some of these countries. They were all in shambles, and therefore young people actually started wondering whether right-wing economics or capitalism or this kind of idea and the divisiveness of that politics, whether that's really good for them or not. But in India, I see the similarities, but it's like just toppled over.
Exactly.
Right? Why do you think that is for in the Indian case?
Because the thing is that the BJP and no real Indian party is actually economically or fiscally right-wing. Modi in 2019 ran a statist or welfarist campaign, and that campaign was about toilets, and it was about the 6,000 rupees to the farmers, right? And I met a lot of farmers who, that's a lot of money for a lot of people. And having a toilet when you never had a toilet earlier makes a huge difference. And you know, the thing is that if you look at the 2000, I don't want to get too academic, but if you look at the 2004 Indian election, macroeconomically, India did amazingly well, right? All of this money was pouring into the country, and they ran an India Shining campaign. The only issue was that people in the villages didn't feel that way. And the Congress ran a very pro-welfare campaign, and they won, you know, nobody expected them to win, and they won. So the BJP realized this, and they said, you know, we are not going to win on right-wing economics. That's why it also took them so long to privatize Air India. And the only time Modi has actually backed down has been when Rahul Gandhi attacked him over land acquisition and said, "Ye to suit boot ki sarkar hai," and he actually backed down. And that was a fairly fiscally right-wing, you know, measure they were going to take, but they didn't do it. It still hasn't been done because in every party in India offers some level of socialism. It just sort of depends on, you know, how much of socialism you're going to get, but you are going to get high chunks of it. And so in India, you know, the programs that really do well are welfare programs. So in Madhya Pradesh, where I've done a lot of my field work in the 2018 state elections, the two parties were fighting with each other in how many welfare schemes can we give. So one person's offering 10,000 unemployment allowance, the other guy is doing 12,000. One person's offering 10,000 at the time of marriage to a girl, the other one's offering 15,000. But no one is actually saying, okay, we're going to create these schemes to get jobs over here. No, that was not even a part of the conversation because it doesn't resonate. You know, I'd much rather get a welfare program than, you know, a job that might never materialize and I might not be even able to do because if I'm a woman, I'll get married and I might have to stay at home. And if I'm a man, I might have to go back to the farm for 4 months of the year. And how can I ever undertake a formal job?
Okay. And do you think, so my last question on the political part is about, so while you were doing the research is also when we saw the anti-CAA movement happening, at least in the cities, in the big cities, I don't sense any of that. Was it totally absent in the small towns? There was absolutely no conversation around it.
Yeah, and you know, this is a question I've received before about the support against CAA among young people, and this is very much a very urban
particular class.
particular type of urban as
Yeah.
well phenomenon. So in Delhi, I can speak to it being a JNU, South Delhi, Gurgaon, East Delhi type of, particular type of young person who came out. And I'd assume the same, in Bangalore and in Mumbai and in all of that. In Mumbai, it happened in Kolaba. I think we know the demographics of Kolaba. And so at the end of the day, these policies are incredibly widely supported among young Indians. I mean, and by that I mean CAA and NRC.
Because it goes back to the protection
Exactly.
story.
That,
again.
that, hey, we have limited resources, we have to keep them for ourselves. We can't let it go to the Bangladeshi or the Pakistani or, whoever.
Unless they're persecuted Hindus, in which we can.
Exactly. But, I'll be honest, I'm not super familiar with the CAA and when the cutoff date is, but I think that a lot of people who are actually like the Bangladeshis, Hindus who are being persecuted right now, I actually don't think they're eligible under CAA. They're not, right? Yeah, exactly. And so that's real persecution that's happening. But those people are never going to, get the rewards of whatever rewards exist. But yeah, so net, like at the end of the day, these are very, widely supported policies. Yeah.
So thanks, Vihan. Before we open up and get some opinions from our millennials who are here listening to us, I had one last question. So this book is full of these amazing, interesting, exciting characters that you've decided to talk about them. There's Ravindra, Gagan, Vinita, Sajid, Nazneen, Priyanka, Radhe. I mean, I found all of their stories so interesting, and they give, they sort of give color to an otherwise like more statistical, insightful kind of book. And you said you did 900 interviews, right? How did you choose the ones that you wanted in the story? And secondly, do you think you have something in mind where all the 900 stories might be on some website or somewhere, which can further help, maybe, I don't know, help other researchers who are looking at this? Or how do you plan to do that?
Oh, that's actually a really good idea. I haven't thought about it, putting all 900 online.
Or you could sell it to brands. I mean, they would be dying to get that.
Well,
900.
I do that as like my actual job.
If that's your, those are your stories, your intellectual property.
Exactly.
So,
no, but it's a great question about who to include and who to leave out. And at the end of the day, I really wanted to talk about regular people who we don't often always hear from in the media. And if you watch Bollywood, and I'm talking about Bollywood in particular because not all Indian cinema is as much in a bubble as Bollywood is. But, if you predominantly watch Bollywood movies and read, watch certain channels or read certain newspapers, you would have a totally different image of India than what actually exists. And so the whole purpose of my book was to talk about really average, ordinary people who are representative of this generation. And so some of these people are doing extraordinary things, and they might not reflect the data. And then some of these people are completely representative of the data, and we need to be talking about them. Like, we need to talk about how many young women are not, treated fairly in their domestic situations, and how it's still incredibly difficult, no matter how educated you are, to break out of the situations you were born into. And so I basically wanted to talk about people that we don't often hear from in the media, and that's sort of where I came from in including the stories and the anecdotes in the book.
Okay. Thanks. And I was wondering, and you mentioned this question in the book somewhere, that some people had asked you, especially the education and economic aspiration, that how is this a millennial problem? Wasn't this always the situation in India? And I really liked your response. So if you would like to share that, why is it specifically a millennial question?
Well, thank you. And then, like, it's always been like this. What's different is that the whole expectation from liberalization and from previous generations is that this generation will be different, right? This generation is going to be the generation of nation builders. And this generation, I remember, when the Beijing Olympics happened in 2008, I was a teenager, and it was incredible, the bird's nest, and seeing, the images of China and back then, India was growing so fast, the first 8, 9 years. And there was this expectation, at least in Delhi, and I think over here as well, that it was just a matter of time, like 5 years, maybe a decade before India catches up to China. But, it's 13 years now,
And the gap has widened.
and the gap has widened. And the whole thing was that millennials are going to be the one who really build India and take it forward. But most of the millennials who I met, particularly the older millennials, are now, they believe the ship has sailed for them and they've missed the bus, and now it's the next generation. And I'm like, that's the real tragedy. And my book is not, supposed to be a positive, sunny story. It's a call to action that, like, let's do what we can while we can still, have some type of impact. Because previous generations had sort of accepted, okay, there's socialism, the economy hasn't opened up, it's still a poor country, recovering from colonialism. But that all got over a long time ago. And this is really, the years that India has and Indian millennials and our youth has to really make something of ourselves.
Yeah. And really I was left with a very, I must say, a sad feeling at the end of the book. Not just because my generation is the one previous to that, so you can't totally forego feeling responsible partly for it and being complicit in what you're talking about, but also because I felt, at least as a 70s generation, we had hope and we had certain dreams. The 80s generation, as we say, beginning of the millennials, they were born into a world where there were so many things that were supposed to happen and none of that did. So I think that kind of crashed even before it took off, which seems quite sad. And therefore, when I look at it, I see a very anxious, a very insecure, but superbly talented and wanting to do things, full of energy kind of a person, feeling totally trapped in the social political scenario of this country. And that's really the sad part.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The aspiration, right?
The aspiration is there, but there's nothing that you can do about it because it won't allow you to.
Exactly.
And if you do make it well, it's sheer luck sometimes and nothing else. So thank you so much, Vivan, for this book. We would like to request, if listening to our conversation, and I don't know if any of you have read this book, do the millennials in the audience have something to share, ask Vivan, and the others as well, of course. But maybe we should begin with the millennials. This book is about you.
Hi. So when you spoke about the political affiliations of millennials and how it's largely BJP and how they seek a protector or a chowkidar or something like that, to me it sounds like they're trying to fill some kind of parental void almost. So I was just wondering if through your research you were able to identify why there's this longing for like protection and like safety and security.
Yeah, so that's like very, astute observation, which I address in my book, is that protector comes in because of the economic insecurity angle. That if you don't have a job and if you haven't had a job for a long time, the person who's going to promise you a welfare program and to keep you safe, from, enemies, foreign and domestic, is the one who you're naturally going to support. And so, the language of aspiration that's mixed in. But then there's also the lack of awareness that people don't often correlate the fact that they don't have a job with the performance of the government. So it's like, oh, I don't have a job because I wasn't good enough. Or I don't have a job because that's just how it is, right? In these small towns, there have never been formal jobs and there will not be a formal job. So people want government jobs, but the correlation of government performance with job creation does not really exist in many parts of India. And even in southern states, actually doesn't exist to a large extent. And so then it comes on to these emotional issues that, oh, like this guy is promising me stability, which I lack in my life. And this guy is, people did say, Pita, because, they want that, that father who will give them some type of benefit and give them some type of a handout that, because they lack this in their everyday lives.
Yeah, I want to know about Grihini scheme.
Which scheme?
Grihini scheme that
Okay.
is only in Goa at the moment. So I want to know more about this. Is it going to be implemented all over India, or it's going to ever start off outside Goa? Because you spoke about young women and the bad domestic life, but this has been from the past. This issue has been there for ages. Right now, even though there is a lot of openness, still this issue is prevalent in some genre, some societies. So that is why this Granny scheme is of utmost importance, which takes care of the wages of household, uh, where most of the Indian women are denied. So there are a lot of statistics about the value of this amount, which is yet to be determined. So this is right at the moment only implemented in Goa. So
Okay, yeah. So I'm actually not familiar with the scheme you're talking about, but there are many schemes specifically for women that are very popular. So Mamta Banerjee had them in Bengal, and women were her biggest supporters. Nitish Kumar had them in Bihar, and women are his biggest supporters. And so women focus schemes are very popular, and they've been going around for quite a while, in many different parts of India.
But there are a lot of schemes, women schemes in India.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of women schemes in India. But why is that this scheme is not popular? I mean,
I'm not aware of this particular scheme, so I can't speak to that. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Hey, so my name is Albert. Thanks for writing the book. I could relate to a lot of things that you've written.
Can you come a bit closer?
I
Thank
could
you.
relate to a
Yeah.
lot of the
Yeah.
things that you've written in the book, which is amazing. So one of the things I think growing up as a millennial also, I think I kept hearing this 2020, like that's the age that India is going to be better. And I could understand a lot of stories that you also written here. So I am right now like in the education sector, and there is a feeling of like a little bit of helplessness at some points that even, I mean, we are able to do a lot of things. And actually one of the companies you mentioned in the beginning, I am from Masai School. And I could relate so much to the students that we have, right? And there were like a lot of stories. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to try to limit to one or two. So one thing I keep noticing is that the amount of women who apply to us, or even generally women interested in science, right, or applying for jobs in this, we have a huge drop in this sector here. And this is a huge problem, and it could definitely be one of those things which elevate the economy, or just like from a very low level, in like from the ground up, right? Because it can create huge network effects. So what are your opinions on why women could do better, how women could do better in this side? Second, generally from a student perspective, like because from the interviews you had, I'm sure you have more interviews there. What do they really look for when it comes to the kind of education they're looking for, or what changes would they want? Because most of them haven't seen a real or the right way of teaching in many aspects, right? So try to limit to two questions.
No, Neil, thanks for your questions. And first off, I will say that I'm not a scholar on gender or feminist issues. So what I will answer is the interviews that I did. And in the interviews I did, I found that the most empowered women that I met were empowered because they were financially independent and they had jobs that allowed them to either have their own income or, to go one step further, to live on their own. So they could take, whatever decisions they were making. And even married women who were very empowered were those who were, again, financially secure on their own, so that, if something happened, that they knew that I can live on my own and I don't need to tolerate, this whatever treatment I'm getting, because I don't know if I'll be able to live on my own if I leave, or if I quit, whatever relationship I'm in. So I think what I'm really getting to is financial empowerment, which comes largely from having a job, or then, what some states are doing in welfare programs, is, really key to, female empowerment in India. You can't, they go completely hand in hand. And then, what students are looking for is like, jobs. Because in India, when you look at the unemployment numbers, the highest unemployment, and unemployment increases with the more educated you are. And the highest unemployment is among the most educated. So there's a phenomena over here called educated unemployment. And it's the highest in the world. And so what students need are jobs. Because they're not, they're investing a lot of money in their education and they're not getting them. And that's a problem because the education system is also a filtering system, so it doesn't really serve their needs. But yeah, I mean, I'm going to be crude and just say a job is what students need.
Yeah, but just to add to that, I mean, for jobs, it's skills that's what lack over there, right? And for
No, the jobs are not there also, no? It's not just skills. It's the number of jobs. So is this book, I don't know if you've read it, but you should. Yeah, you must read this. The books are available, by the way, outside. Please pick up a copy and Vivan, you will sign it for them.
I will sign as many copies as you like.
But he talks about how the sheer number of jobs that are required. So we might blame it on, not the right skills, etc. But the numbers are missing. So for every job, and you give some numbers here, I forget, for so many jobs, so many lakhs of people apply. Yeah. Now you can tell them you're not skilled or you're not right, but actually those numbers don't exist. That's a huge issue.
I think what he's getting at is the fact that many degrees or many providers don't prepare you for the job. So
that's true.
There's a number that 97% of engineers are not employable for any job in the knowledge economy. So startups in Bangalore compete for the 3%. And that's why also salaries are, are very high, because you're competing for a very small number of people. So then I guess to answer your question, you need better education. But that's not going to come from the current system that exists, because the system that exists is not to educate, it's to get into IIT, or it's to get into, AIMS, or it's to get a government job. So a complete new paradigm is...
So just one last, I mean, I agree with that. I've read the book and I understand that I'm speaking from a very biased point of view of only software side. So that's probably why. But just wanted to touch upon, if you had a choice of, let's say, you could change state education at maybe, let's say, college level, maybe first years, or versus 8th standard or versus 4th standard. If you had a choice, which area would you try to touch upon if you...
I would start at the primary level, so elementary school.
But that's a much more harder problem to solve, right?
Yeah, but that's the most important one. And again, I cite figures in the book. I remember them right now, but like most kids who are in class 5 don't know the things they should have learned in class 1. Most kids in class 8 don't know what stuff they should have learned in class 5. These problems, then they just keep getting worse and worse. And many of those kids then actually end up in college and they don't know stuff they should have learned in school. So you start off at elementary school. In my book, I write about a school I visited in Bihar where I was attending the computer class, and it was a classroom without computers. And there was just a blackboard, and there were 5 statements, true or false. The first one is computer like a calculator. True or false. Computer can do calculations. True or false. Computer stores information. How on earth is someone going to know anything about computers when that is what they're learning about computers? So you start at the very early stage. Yeah.
But don't you think
we can give some other people?
Also, just to add, Vivan, we do a lot of work in government schools across Karnataka in different districts. And just the insufficient infrastructure of these places and the pressure that is put on the teachers, the government teachers, is huge. So there is a single teacher sometimes for 3 classes of all the students in the same space. They're just divided by groups.
Or there's 2 classrooms for 8 grades.
Yeah. And those classrooms you cannot use those classrooms in monsoon because they constantly pour down through the classroom. So I'm saying that when you go into the government school scenario, which is the largest sector of education anyway, the highest percent, it's abysmal. I don't know where the money for education actually goes.
Get someone over.
And please.
Hi, thanks for this great conversation. I want to talk about actually the figures that you brought up in the 3rd chapter, was it? Where you said that there was more of a religious identity as opposed, even though there was more education. You said that because of the internet, there was a kind of anonymity, and hence you wanted to establish your identity, and hence you hark back to your spiritual sort of identity. But given like what's happening right now with Facebook and the whistleblowing, would you say that the internet was actually a source of this identity? That it actually worked the other way around? Internet was not anonymity, but a place where you could bolster your religious identity.
Absolutely, it sort of solidifies, like you're coming to you're going down a path, and then the internet provides you with directions of how to, make it to your final destination. But it goes both ways. So for every person who, whose internet activity you may not agree with, or you may not like, their views, there's also many other people on the other side who've been able to really use it to their advantage. And what I mean when I say that is, in a lot of towns and villages in India, there are still no physical places for women to gather and talk to each other, or for Dalits or other minorities to meet each other. But they can do it on the internet, right? They can have these interactions with other people of their communities on the internet. And so it gives them that space that's not available to them in the physical world. So, but they have that on the online world. And absolutely, I know exactly what you're talking about, that, the whistleblower and what's going on in India with Facebook, that it's fueled a lot of polarization and hatred. And again, I don't take any position on this issue, but my main thing is to share what I found in the interviews that I did, and that for every, negative story, I did find two positive stories that sort of, kind of outweighed it. And, people who I know in Delhi, Christian women from Jharkhand who couldn't attend church during the pandemic were watching it online on YouTube, and it has all of these other, positive advantages that we don't often hear about. And it's a great equalizer.
But it also comes I was listening to what you were saying, and I was thinking that in every new space or new horizon that human beings find, and it becomes an enabler for equality, etc. As time passes, that same space, we infect it with the same
with what exists in real life,
which is in the other space. So while at one end I see how all kinds of marginalized voices find space on the internet, whether they are Dalit or queer voices or women's voices, homemakers, and at the same time, the loud, dominant narrative sort of single story voices of the real world slowly creep in and then start monopolizing that as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So it takes on from that question and also what you just said. It did bring a lot of things together. It's really nice to hear that caste is such a significant part of your research. But could you also talk about maybe a little more about identity formation in terms of caste? Like, how is caste being reimagined in the contemporary by millennials? Did you also speak to a lot of upper caste people? What's happening there?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll answer the question with two examples. The first one is someone I write about named Gagan, and he's a courier in Bhopal who's from the Nai caste. Every man in his family before him has been a Nai, and for those not familiar, Nai are barbers. And he is the first one in his family who was not a Nai, not a barber, and he's working as a courier trying to get a government job in Madhya Pradesh. And so he's someone, who's kind of breaking out of that. Maybe it doesn't fit, the income does not fit his aspirations, but whatever it is, he's trying to break out of it, and he's able to do that because he lives in the city that's urbanizing, and these opportunities are coming. The second part of your question is that, again, a lot of my book, it is it's not easy a positive reading because it's the reality that there is not a lot of upper caste solidarity with with people who are not from the upper caste. And so growing up in Delhi as well, I remember 10 years ago, the fact that AIMS had cutoffs of 98%, and Delhi University has general category cutoff of 99 point whatever 8%, really pissed a lot of people off. And there was almost zero understanding of what life is like for people from different backgrounds, and that continues to today. And a lot of my work for the book, but also my professional work, involves me, being on the internet and understanding users and how they use the internet. And a lot of upper caste young men in particular are very proud of their upper caste identity. So a lot of Instagram accounts that I've come across are proud Brahmin, proud Rajput, proud this, proud that. And there's this a lot of, these people have thousands and thousands of followers, and they post daily proud pro-Brahmin, content. And so there's not, that solidarity does not exist. And it's definitely, I write this in the book as well, that the internet does enable people to live in those silos, and it reinforces those silos as well.
Hello? Okay. I think I just barely qualify for this questioning because I'm a 96 born.
No, you just
made
I just made it. I make it to both conversations. Yeah, but I think my question is a little away from... it's not really a question. It's just something I wonder as a millennial / Gen Z. It's about confusion. It's a feeling of like not knowing if what I'm doing is enough when I become valid, or maybe just like the questions around a happy life or like a peaceful life. And then it doesn't stop at getting a job. Like I think maybe I have a more privileged context, but in college I had friends who came from smaller towns, and then their entire goal was to get a job, and they did get a job, and they did really well. And then in 2 years, their joy fizzled out. They started searching for meaning. They were like, what is this about? What is life? Going into that, it's kind of cold. In that realm of questioning. And then I started to wonder if like, can we really separate the conversation of opportunity from like this inherent like search for meaning, and like what is the other aspect of life? Can we say it comes after the, like I know those Maslow needs and like this kind of, can we really separate those two, or do they have to happen simultaneously? Because I feel like right now it's, maybe I'm in a different bubble, but the questions around like feeling enough and belonging are like right next to opportunity and economic stability. Because otherwise it's very incomplete.
Yeah, I know that conversation is very valid for a lot of people, but I'm sure you acknowledge this, or you could mention it again, is that those are sort of people who have good jobs or who come from privilege, right? So when you have a certain level of security and stability and privilege, like, yeah, then meaning and purpose matters. But if you're just trying to put 2 meals on your table and not go to bed hungry, then none of that matters. You're going to do anything that allows you to do that. So it's very much a problem of like, the 1%, I would say that. And I'm sorry, yeah. Yes, of course.
I mean, I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
Like, first of all, like, but when we talk about like getting, okay, let's provide opportunity. Suddenly we have like 30% of the country suddenly has jobs. If that's like a problem to, like, you have a problem, no jobs, now we give you a job, and in 2 years, if the same questions are coming, is it really a solution? And so it's like, of course, if you're talking about complete below the poverty line and like 2 meals on the table versus somebody who is going to suddenly have that job, have 2 meals on the table, what's next for them? And what's the viability of that solution? And is it really a solution if you're just providing a fix to an immediate problem?
I mean, a job with dignity is absolutely a solution. A job that has dignity. I was reading, there's a lot of research that, for example, like when you look at what's going on in the US, with a lot of the people who are moving to the Republicans over there, they are people who lost their jobs a few years ago, a few decades ago, and those were jobs with dignity. So, for example, we might look down on a coal miner, but a coal miner in West Virginia used to make about more than $100,000 and could finance vacations abroad and to send their kids to college and to buy them homes, because that was a job that paid well and had dignity. And similarly, for factory jobs, and the people who have those jobs in India are very happy, but that's a very small number of people who have those jobs in India. So I guess it's like, you first move to jobs, then you move to jobs with dignity, and then you sort of reach your sweet spot. But before that, it's sort of a moot conversation. Yeah.
But Vivaan, it's also true that the relationship between prosperity and happiness is a very complex one.
Absolutely,
and one can't draw easy combinations there. I mean, I remember recently I was having a conversation with Dr. Jain from NIMHANS and Sanjeev Jain from NIMHANS, and we were talking about insanity and this whole question about whether prosperity has anything to do with mental health issues. And suddenly he said, Switzerland, which if you look at Scandinavian countries as such, all kinds of parameters have the highest quality of life. I mean, all those parameters, trees per person, teachers per student, doctors per person, all kinds of parameters. And yet, very high levels of death by suicide because of mental issues, illnesses, afflictions, know. So prosperity and happiness, I guess, are a complicated relationship.
No, I mean, I'm the millennial guy, so like.
No, but what you're saying is right, that if like roti kapra makan nahi hai, to tum kya sochoge, na?
Exactly.
And that's why if you see most of our election campaigns are still about roti kapra makan.
Yeah.
It's about jobs. It's about the 15 lakhs that didn't come to our banks. All of that,
exactly.
Right? Yeah.
We have some more questions. Yeah.
I am Harsha. Congratulations, Vivaan, for the book.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One is, I came late. I just wanted to know, I'm just curious to know, how did you select the states and the respondents for your study? And second one, I think you must have heard of Pew report on religion.
Yeah.
In the light of the report, what is your observations when it comes to millennials?
Yeah.
Just these are the two.
So I picked the states almost equally in the 4 regions of India. So I spent a lot of time here. I spent a lot of time in Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Coimbatore area. And obviously north, west, all of that. And so I picked, states. My fieldwork was all over. So I didn't leave. I have left parts of the northeast out. But otherwise, where most of India lives, that's where I went. And yeah, the Pew survey is cited in my book as well. And so it's if you have a chance to go through the book, it's cited in there. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you see more hands? Any other questions? From non-millennials as well. We are opening the
boomers.
The boomers. Yeah. Anything you want to say, Vivaan, at the end, sort of something you've gained. Okay, something you've gained doing this book.
It's been really great. The best validation I've got writing this book have been, the PhD student in Orissa who messaged me on LinkedIn a while ago, and the housewife in Nasik who messaged me on Instagram, and these are people who are completely outside of my network and my spheres of influence, and just completely people from all over the country picking up the book and sharing their thoughts with me about what resonated. I also a few days ago got an email from someone who hated the book, but he was really nice. He gave me paragraphs of what was wrong, and I appreciated it, right? Because like it was constructive, and it was all he was citing page numbers and all of that, and so just sort of the response has been really nice. My editor is here in the audience. We went into a reprint a while ago, so it's been nice. Wonderful. For the book to also be doing well. And the last thing I'm totally shameless, so please, not just buy the book, but you can find me on Twitter and Instagram and all of that with first name, last name, Vivaan Marwah. So if you have any more questions, you can always message me. I reply to everyone. But yeah, to really get this conversation started about Indian millennials and to thoughtfully contribute to it, and about how we really build on India's future by capitalizing on the potential of our youth.
Thanks, Vivaan, for writing this book. I think it'll be a very useful tool I was thinking from marketing and brand managers to educationists to people making policy, but also political mobilizers. I think it's a very insightful book for anybody who is in the profession, designers, who is in the profession of making something for millennials, either in a commercial way or in any other way. So thank you so much. One of the things that I had wondered, that does he have insider bias? He's a millennial. Is this book going to be, not colored by his? And I think, Vivaan, you've done a wonderful job of not once making me feel that there is that insider bias. So I will add to your shamelessness and say, please buy the book. It's all outside. And thank you very much for being such a accommodative audience, such a curious audience. Thank you very much. It feels wonderful to do physical events once again. Yeah. So thanks, Vivaan.
Thanks
the
everyone.
audience.
Yeah.